I love Radiohead. I also love discussing the music theory that underlies their songs. I've already made a video essay about their song Scatterbrain, and if I had the time and resources, there are probably 30 to 40 Radiohead songs that would be excellent topics for other video essays. There's so much to learn from these songs, but alas, it would take me many years to cover them all. Or would it? Perhaps it is possible to do so from another perspective. Usually when I analyze a song, I zoom in on every detail until the inner workings of each chord change are uncovered. But instead, suppose I zoomed out, reducing the song's details to general simplified attributes. And then, suppose I did this for every Radiohead song. This won't help us understand individual songs, but it might provide some answers to a whole other realm of questions. Questions like, what kinds of scales and chord changes do Radiohead like the most? What trends are there from album to album? What are the most harmonically complex Radiohead songs? Usually, these kinds of questions are doomed to be the subject of barroom debates that never come to a satisfying answer. But now I would like to approach them with as much objectivity as possible by assessing, in aggregate, the functional harmony used throughout Radiohead's discography. This is a big project with a lot of details. I want to briefly discuss the project's scope, limitations, and procedures, but understandably you may only be interested in the results. If so, feel free to skip ahead. The chapters in this video are labeled to help you navigate to the charts and graphs that summarize my findings. Radiohead has quite a large discography. 9 studio albums, 7 EPs, 3 remastered albums with previously unreleased tracks, a couple of live albums and remix albums, and tons of non-album singles or singles with non-album B-sides. In order not to drive myself crazy, I'm limiting my analysis to their 9 studio albums only. This turns out to be exactly 100 songs, a nice round number. Anyway, here's what I did for each track. First, I figured out all of the chords, then I assigned a function to each chord, and finally I cataloged every feature of the resulting chord progression. For this last step, I didn't bother with all the diatonic features that are common to almost all Western music. Instead, I focused on things like modulations, chord borrowings, etc. The end result is a sort of functional harmony dossier for each song. To illustrate, here's how steps 1 and 2 played out for Glass Eyes off of the album A Moon-Shaped Pool. The song structures, chords, and functions for each section are pretty straightforward. All I have to do for step 3 is to tabulate the features and voila, numbers that can be compared at a glance to other songs' numbers and then compiled into charts. If you're a data junkie like me, you should already be salivating. But I quickly learned that things aren't always this simple. To start with, what key is this song in? Looking at the A section, it appears to be in C minor with all diatonic chords. But in the B section, we start borrowing a few chords, B flat minor and D flat major from the C Phrygian mode. In fact, all the chords in the B section fit nicely in the Phrygian mode. So is it more sensible to say that the whole song is in C minor with a few borrowed chords, or that the B section modulates to C Phrygian? The exact line between borrowed chords and modulations, and between borrowing X chords into the Y scale versus borrowing Y chords into the X scale, can be rather blurry, especially for a band like Radiohead who love using ambiguous tonalities. I tried to stick to certain rules. For instance, if the one chord in a given section was major, then I usually assume the section is in one of the major modes, with any additional minor key features being borrowed. But I often had to just rely on my intuition. There's one more ambiguous detail in Glass Eyes. In the transition between the B section and the C section, what function does this B natural major chord serve? I think many people would assume it is a 7 major chord, borrowed from some scale with an obscene number of sharps. But personally, I think it makes more sense to label it a flat 1 chord, really a C flat major, borrowing from some scale with a slightly less obscene number of flats. I brought up this song specifically because it has a bunch of different interpretations that are totally reasonable. Most of Radiohead's songs are less ambiguous, but nonetheless there's a certain amount of fuzziness to the overall picture, though hopefully my conclusions will still be generally correct. Of course, there's one final limitation, namely that I focus on Radiohead's use of functional harmony only. Other aspects of harmony like chord voicings, melody, voice leading, etc. aren't applicable, not to mention other aspects of music like rhythm, texture, instrumentation, and song structure. So while I may come to certain conclusions about the functional harmonic complexity of Radiohead's music, this should not be mistaken for general complexity. In fact, some of Radiohead's most complex songs have relatively simple functional harmony. And of course, even general complexity isn't really a measure of whether music is good. Simple songs can be amazing and impactful, and conversely, complex songs can be tacky or unartful. Fundamentally, what makes music good is a lot more subjective than anything I can analyze. Anyway, now that that's all out of the way, let's get down to business. We'll start with something simple. What keys do Radiohead most like to use? In a way, this doesn't really matter much to music theory analysis. A set of chord functions have roughly the same impact whether they're in A major or E flat major or any other key. But it's easy enough to look at the data, so why not? Here is a chart of the equivalent major keys used in each Radiohead song, arranged by album. And when I say equivalent major key, I'm equating, for example, D major with all of its modes, including E Dorian, F sharp Phrygian, G Lydian, A Mixolydian, and B minor. All of these scales contain the same notes, often described in terms of the number of sharps or flats, in this case, 2 sharps. So in this way, the key of D major has much more in common with B minor than with D minor, even though D major and D minor have the same root note. Also, note that some songs modulate from one key to another. In that case, I counted each of the different keys used in the song. This chart can also be summarized by the average number of sharps or flats in the keys used per album, as well as a rough measurement of the spread of these keys. For statistical reasons I don't want to get into, I will generally use mean absolute deviation to measure spread. As you can see, Radiohead use a variety of keys throughout their discography, but in their first 2 albums, especially Pablo Honey, they tend to gravitate towards a narrow range of keys, in particular what are known as guitar keys. The diatonic chords in these keys mostly have easy-to-play open fingerings on the guitar. In the E standard tuning, which Radiohead usually plays in, the guitar keys are generally between C major and E major, that is, keys with 0 to 4 sharps. On Pablo Honey, a whopping 6 songs are in the equivalent key of G major, which many consider to be the easiest key to play in on the guitar. The spread of keys for these 2 albums are accordingly among the lowest in their discography. On OK Computer, Radiohead began using a few keys with more flats, such as F major and even B flat major. Here, the average number of sharps drops from 1.75 to just 1.2, and the spread increases significantly. This trend continues through Kid A, Amnesiac, and finally Hail to the Thief, on which we even find We Suck Young Blood, Radiohead's sole track in the equivalent key of D flat major with 5 flats. Indeed, this album has the second largest spread of keys. If keys with sharps are guitar keys, then keys with flats could be thought of as piano keys or brass keys. It's possible that Radiohead's growing use of these keys reflects their increasingly diverse instrumentation over this period, or it may simply be due to the band members' increasing skill at their instruments. This trend is interrupted on In Rainbows, which sees a return to largely guitar keys with the highest average number of sharps, just under 2. This coincides with Radiohead's return to less experimental pop songs for this album, songs in which guitar plays a somewhat greater role. But then, on The King of Limbs, we see the lowest average number of sharps, -1, or rather 1 flat. It's the only album to have an average key with flats instead of sharps, as well as the album with the lowest spread. This average key makes sense for a more electronic album, where guitar plays a less important role. Finally, on A Moon-Shaped Pool, the average key is somewhat in the middle of Radiohead's typical range, with around 1 sharp, but the spread is the highest of Radiohead's discography, with the keys on this album being on average 2.5 sharps or flats away from its average key. More important than the key, though, is the primary mode used in each song. In most pop music, the major and minor are used the most frequently, but other modes such as the Phrygian, Dorian, Mixolydian, or Lydian are used occasionally. These modes can be ordered in terms of how many flats or sharps are used relative to the major key. Generally, the more flats a mode has, the more dark or minor it sounds. Here is a chart of the modes used in Radiohead songs arranged by album. This chart can also be summarized by each album's average mode in terms of the number of flats, as well as the spread of modes around the average. As with the key, if the song modulates to a different mode, then I count each mode separately. But if a modulation occurs between the same mode in different keys, such as in Morning Bell, which modulates from A Dorian to E Dorian and back, then it is only counted once. There are quite a few very clear trends here. Radiohead strongly prefer the major scale in their first 2 albums, with only 2 songs from each album using other modes. You and Blowout from Pablo Honey, and My Iron Lung and Street Spirit Fade Out from the Bends. But then, suddenly, on OK Computer, Radiohead seemed to discover the use of other modes, especially the minor scale, though there are still quite a few major key songs on this album. Kid A likewise has a variety of modes, even showing a slight preference towards the major scale. And then, on Amnesiac, Radiohead fully embraces the minor scale, with the average number of flats jumping from 1.6 to nearly 2.5. The Dorian scale, with 2 flats, is second most common on Amnesiac, and the only song on this album to even use the major scale is Pull Pulk Revolving Doors, which, some might argue, barely even qualifies as a song. Kid A and Amnesiac were recorded in tandem, and most people tend to see them as close companions, but this chart illustrates how distinct they are in their choice of modes. From there, Radiohead continued to strongly prefer the minor scale throughout Hail to the Thief and In Rainbows. But starting with In Rainbows, we begin to see Radiohead using the Mixolydian mode with greater frequency, on tracks like Body Snatchers and House of Cards, for example. The King of Limbs is the peak of this trend, with no major key songs at all. The Mixolydian mode has a monopoly on the major-sounding content of this album. Give Up the Ghost and Separator are the most obvious examples, while others such as Good Morning Mr. Magpie and Little by Little infuse the Mixolydian mode with some unusual borrowed chords. These preferences have a strikingly longitudinal character, continuing from album to album in somewhat overlapping trends. This can be visualized on the chart as sort of vertical bars. From the perspective of these trends, you could even refer to various periods of Radiohead's discography as their major period, minor period, and Mixolydian period, which I find rather amusing. There are a couple of other general trends that we can identify in this chart. To begin with, Radiohead never used the Lydian mode as the primary mode of a song. There aren't a whole lot of pop songs that use the Lydian mode this way, perhaps because the tension of the mode's sharp fourth makes it feel uncomfortable as the song's metaphorical resting place, though I was still a little surprised at this finding. Radiohead do borrow chords from the Lydian mode occasionally. For example, in Airbag they use a borrowed sharp 4 extension over the 1 major chord, as well as a borrowed 2 major from this mode, but this usage is always in the context of some other key. Radiohead also shy away from using the Phrygian mode, though there are 3 exceptions: Everything in Its Right Place, Pyramid Song, and the bridge of Dex Dark. Notably, all 3 of these use the major Phrygian variant of this mode, though in 2 of the 3 this is mixed with chords from the minor Phrygian. Like the Lydian mode, the Phrygian is less commonly used in pop music, though perhaps Radiohead's preference for darker-sounding minor key music throughout their more experimental periods made this mode a more appealing option. Now that we know what modes are used in each song, we have a context for scrutinizing their chords. Every diatonic mode contains, by default, 7 basic triads. For the purposes of this analysis, I also count the 5 major or dominant chord of the minor scale as essentially diatonic, along with all the equivalent chords in other modes, such as the 3 major or dominant in the major scale. Altogether, these chords are the bread and butter of basically any pop song, and due to their sheer ubiquity, they don't have much impact on the overall sound of the song they are a part of, at least in comparison to non-diatonic features, which will be the subject of this next section. There are 3 general categories of non-diatonic features that I'd like to examine: modulations, borrowed chords, and diatonic chords with borrowed extensions. This last category appears similar to diatonic chords in a functional analysis, but contains other notes from outside the primary key. To illustrate, consider the verse from A Wolf at the Door. The primary mode is D minor, inside which the G minor chord is a diatonic 4 minor, but the voicing of this chord as a G minor flat 6 includes an E flat, a note which would have to be borrowed from the D Phrygian mode. The impact of any of these non-diatonic features can be described by 2 variables, the primary mode and the borrowed or modulated secondary mode. These can be represented in a 2-dimensional heat map chart, such as this one. On the vertical axis are all the possible primary modes that a song could start out using, and on the horizontal axis are the secondary modes a song could borrow from or modulate to. There's a diagonal line in this chart where the 2 modes are the same, indicating no modulation or borrowing. Below the line, the modulation or borrowed chord uses a mode with more flats or a more minor key. Above the line, the modulation or borrowed chord uses a mode with more sharps or a more major key. Each time a new chord was borrowed or a new modulation was used in a given song, I incremented the corresponding cell in this chart by 1. For instance, if I was looking at a minor key song and I borrowed a 2 minor chord from the Dorian mode, then I incremented this cell here, above the line, indicating a more major borrowing. If I was looking at a major key song and it modulated to the parallel minor, then I incremented this cell here, below the line, indicating a modulation to a more minor mode. This is an inventory of Radiohead's harmonic vocabulary, so the chart is not meant to reflect how frequently a feature occurs within each individual song. Whether a particular borrowed chord or modulation occurs only once or dozens of times, the chart is still only incremented by 1. It's either part of the vocabulary for the song or not. Additionally, for the sake of consistency, I assessed all borrowings on a conservative, per-chord basis. To illustrate what I mean by this, consider the verse of Dex Dark, which I interpret as using the D Mixolydian mode. The borrowed chords in this section are B flat, G minor, and F, and I think many people would simply say all these chords are borrowed from the D minor mode. This is a reasonable interpretation, but for the sake of being systematic, I would say the F is actually borrowed from the D Dorian mode, as this is the closest mode to D Mixolydian that contains an F major chord, having only 1 more flat. For the other 2 chords, the D minor mode with 2 more flats is the closest. Sometimes there are multiple ways to interpret where a chord is borrowed from. Consider the verse of Exit Music for a Film. It's pretty clearly in the key of B minor. In that setting, the E major chord serves as a 4 major, borrowed from the B Dorian scale with 1 more sharp than B minor. But then consider the chorus. The A minor and E major chords are probably meant to imitate a 1 minor 5 dominant cadence. If we borrow A minor from the B Phrygian mode, which is the closest mode to contain this chord, then shouldn't E major also be attributed to this mode, which has one fewer sharp than B minor? In other words, the same E major chord has two different interpretations depending on the context. Throughout this project, I occasionally had to make case-by-case decisions like this. Anyway, let's get to the charts, one for each album. In addition to the non-diatonic features, I also put a count of the primary modes on the diagonal line. It's easy to see at a glance the distribution or even just the general minor-major direction of the non-diatonic features in each album. It's also easy to see individual modulations or borrowings that each album seems to prefer. For instance, the most common non-diatonic features in the Benz omnipresent major modes are from the Dorian mode, though the Lydian mode is not far behind. OK Computer, Amnesiac, and Hail to the Thief all really like using the Dorian mode in a minor key setting, with OK Computer also frequently using the Phrygian mode in that setting. A moon-shaped pool also really likes using the Phrygian mode in a minor key setting, but also frequently incorporates the minor key within the setting of the Mixolydian mode. All of these charts can also be summarized by an average direction, showing how much flatter or sharper a mode the non-diatonic features are generally from, as well as by spread, showing how far these non-diatonic features are from the primary mode on average. The spread is actually quite consistent from album to album, ranging from 1.91 to 1.44, meaning that on average Radiohead usually take non-diatonic features from 1 to 2 keys away on the circle of fifths. But the values for the average direction show a much more significant pattern. Starting with Pablo Honey and the Benz, the average direction is about 1 degree flatter. On OK Computer and Kid A, it's close to 0, and then on Amnesiac it's half a degree sharper, before returning close to 0 again for Hail to the Thief. At first, it seems like this metric might just have an inverse correlation with the average primary mode of the album. After all, albums that use more major scales have a larger selection of typical borrowings from a minor direction and vice versa. But then, In Rainbows defies these expectations. Despite being the second most minor album behind Amnesiac, its non-diatonic features are from a significantly more minor direction, 0.7 flats on average, which is almost as much as the 0.8 flats average of the nearly all major Pablo Honey, and also quite far away from Amnesiac's 0.5 sharp average. Some of these directionally minor borrowings come from In Rainbow's Mixolydian songs, but there are quite a few in its minor key songs as well, such as in the bridge of Body Snatchers and the outro of Weird Fish's Arpeggi, as well as in the modulation that occurs in the transition to the chorus of Faust Arp. The King of Limbs has an average direction of half a degree flat, though if we look at its chart, it's clear that this is mostly due to minor borrowings into its Mixolydian songs. But then, A Moon-Shaped Pool continues the trend started by In Rainbows, with tons of Phrygian borrowings into its minor key songs, including Daydreaming, Full Stop, Glass Eyes, and Present Tense. The average borrowing here is likewise over 0.7 flats. Overall, this trend is especially interesting when coupled with the trend in primary modes. The first half of Radiohead's discography sees a transition from major key songs to minor key songs, and the second half sees a transition from major borrowings in minor key songs to minor borrowings in minor key songs. Borrowed chords are the most common non-diatonic feature, occurring in 77% of all tracks, while modulations only occur in 18%. As a result, the non-diatonic feature heat map charts mostly reflect trends in borrowed chords. So let's take a closer look at modulations on their own. Most Radiohead albums have a few songs with modulations, except for The Benz, which has only one, and Pablo Honey, which has none at all. On the other end of the spectrum is Amnesiac, which has 4 songs with modulations: You and Whose Army, Knives Out, Amnesiac Morning Bell, and Life in a Glass House. And of all of Radiohead's songs, only one has modulations among more than 2 keys, Paranoid Android, which covers 3 keys. Of the 35 distinct modulations that occur in these songs, 32 of them can be paired, which is to say that Radiohead modulates from X to Y and then later in the song back from Y to X. The 3 exceptions to this are the tracks Sulk, Fitter Happier, and You and Whose Army. Since nearly all of the modulations are paired, their data points tend to cancel out when it comes to the average direction of non-diatonic features. However, if we count only the initial direction of paired modulations, we can see a trend. This chart shows the data for each album. As you can see, up through Hail to the Thief, modulations tend to initially add sharps to the key, the exceptions being In Limbo and Life in a Glass House, whereas starting with In Rainbows, modulations tend to initially add flats. Interestingly, this seems to mirror the borrowed chord trend that I explored in the previous section. Overall, Radiohead's final 3 albums are marked by an increased use of both more minor borrowings and modulations whose initial direction is minor. Another aspect of modulation we could look at is the absolute distance of modulation. But from this chart, it is clear that Radiohead never modulates more than 3 keys away on the circle of fifths. In nearly half of them it is an adjacent key. Ultimately, there isn't a strong distance trend from album to album either. Now that we have a grip on the non-diatonic features of Radiohead's music, can we use this to assess its overall functional harmonic complexity? Perhaps, in this thought experiment, complexity just amounts to the number of distinct non-diatonic chords used per song. Here's how this plays out for each album. As you can see, Pablo Honey and the King of Limbs have the least, whereas OK Computer, Hail to the Thief, and especially A Moon-Shaped Pool have the most. Note that I also counted the first chord of a modulation as non-diatonic. This is a decent first pass at the notion of functional harmonic complexity, but there are a couple of other items I think should be included. The first of these focuses on the quality of individual chord changes. Let's look at two major key chord progressions that borrow from the parallel minor. First, in the key of E major is the intro to Planet Telex, whose A minor is borrowed from E minor. Then, in the key of C major is the verse of True Love Waits, whose A flat major 7 is borrowed from C minor. Theoretically, these borrowed chords should have a similar impact, but in practice, the Planet Telex borrowing sounds somewhat smoother, whereas the True Love Waits borrowing seems to really pop out. Why is this? If we look at the Planet Telex chord progression, every individual chord movement can be worked into some diatonic key. The E and A both fit in E major, the A and E7 both fit in A major, and the E7 and A minor both fit in A minor, as do the A minor and E. In contrast, the individual chord changes of True Love Waits are more abrupt. C major 7 and A minor 7 both fit in C major, but no diatonic key contains both A minor 7 and A flat major 7, or both A flat major 7 and C major 7. The slightly unsettling impression made by these movements adds complexity to the song's overall use of functional harmony. All of this invites the question, what types of chord movement have this abrupt non-diatonic quality? To begin with, basic major and minor triads separated by a perfect fourth or a whole tone can always fit into some diatonic key, even if it's a different diatonic key from the primary mode, so we can rule those out. Other intervals are less consistent. Among these possibilities, non-diatonic chord movements generally fit into a few different categories. Perhaps the most common of these are the chromatic mediants chord changes. Whereas regular diatonic mediant chord changes entail a movement by a major or minor third within the same key, chromatic mediant changes move outside the key to a chord with the same major or minor quality. There are also the less common double chromatic mediant changes, whose chords have different qualities despite coming from different keys, as well as chromatic mediants involving other chords like half-diminished or suspended chords. Radiohead really like using chromatic mediants, having an average of 1 per song over their whole discography, which is quite high. The albums with the fewest are The Bends and King of Limbs, whereas Hail to the Thief stands out as having the most. Radiohead also vastly prefer major to major chromatic mediants over minor to minor, with only a scant few double chromatic mediants, all of them being major to minor. There is no overarching trend to these preferences, with the only album that seems to stand out being Amnesiac, whose minor to minor chromatic mediants slightly outnumber the major to major ones. Another somewhat common non-diatonic chord change is to directly alter the quality of the specific chord, generally playing it first as a major and then as a minor, or vice versa. Radiohead like using this chord change as well, though at an average of 0.34 uses per song, it's not quite as common as chromatic mediants. They also tend to use the major to minor version of this chord change somewhat more often than the minor to major version. The one exception to this is, once again, Amnesiac, which in addition to having the most direct chord quality changes, uses minor to major most often. Additionally, on the track Life in a Glass House from this album, there is a back and forth change between the A minor major 7 and the A minor 7 chords, which I felt should be included in this general category, though it's not really major to minor or minor to major. The final two categories of non-diatonic movements are semitonal movements and tritonal movements. It is possible to move by a semitone or a tritone inside a diatonic scale, but only in one or two specific ways. Other combinations of chords using these movements are therefore non-diatonic. Radiohead doesn't use these chord changes quite as much as chromatic mediants or direct chord quality changes, but to use them at all is pretty unconventional in pop music, so they are still a significant factor in Radiohead's aesthetic. There are no strong trends from album to album, but there are specific subcategories they use more than others, preferring major to major semitonal changes over minor to minor, and preferring minor to major slide transformation changes over major to minor. And for tritonal changes, they strongly prefer major to major, with only a smattering of minor to major changes. Due to the infrequency of these features, their appearance in this distribution is typically connected to individual songs. For instance, 3 of OK Computer's 5 tritonal changes occur in the intro to Subterranean Homesick Alien. Besides non-diatonic movements, there are a few other techniques that factor into Radiohead's functional harmonic complexity. One of these is dominant chord subversion. The typical function of a dominant chord is to move forward in the circle of fifths, resolving the chord's tritone to the third of a major or minor chord. When a dominant chord does something else instead, it usually sounds a bit unexpected. In order to assess how often Radiohead subvert dominant chords, I needed to count how many dominant chords they use in general. It turns out that they barely use them at all. No album has more than 1 per song on average, and The King of Limbs actually has none. In fact, dominant chord subversions frequently outnumber dominant chords, as individual dominant chords can be subverted in multiple different ways. The overall frequency of dominant chord subversion is pretty low, but you can see that the Bends and Hail to the Thief use it the most. Of course, the fact that dominant chords are so sparse to begin with is itself pretty striking. They're pretty much a staple of Western harmony, being used extensively in classical jazz and rock music, though modern pop music uses them quite a bit less in favor of simple major chords. Even when a chord would work well with a dominant voicing, Radiohead often prefers non-dominant voicings, leading to a sound that is, for lack of a better word, unjazzy. Another technique that relates to functional harmony is the use of ostinato, that is, the continuous repetition of a musical phrase over a changing context. Of course, rhythmic ostinato is not relevant here, only harmonic ostinato, which could be a repeated bass line or pedal point that plays underneath varying chords, or a repeated melodic phrase that contrasts with varying bass and chord accompaniment. In either case, this usually leads to the simultaneous use of multiple harmonic functions, which adds to functional harmonic complexity even when all these functions are diatonic. Radiohead do not use this technique that often, only 18 times over 100 songs. As a result, it's hard to identify clear album-to-album trends. Lower pedal point-like ostinato and upper melodic ostinato occur with about the same frequency. Interestingly, Airbag uses ostinato in 3 distinct places. The final technique that comes into play is the use of atonal or non-functional harmony. This includes basically any non-diatonic chords that are too arbitrary or abstract for chord functions to really capture their effect. A common example of this is the use of chromatic chord planing. Take for instance the outro to Ripcord from Pablo Honey. If we assigned chord functions to each of these chords, the section would be chock full of borrowed chords and abrupt semitonal changes. But really, these chords are merely meant to have a chromatic effect, and so they sound subjectively less complex than what a functional interpretation would suggest. Of course, in other cases, a touch of atonality can add to the apparent complexity of an otherwise functional progression. Radiohead doesn't use non-functional harmony all that often, especially later in their discography starting with In Rainbows. In total, it is used 10 times in 100 songs. At last, we've covered every feature that contributes to Radiohead's functional harmonic complexity. There are modulations, borrowed chords, diatonic chords with borrowed extensions, non-diatonic chord movements, subverted dominant chords, harmonic ostinatos, and atonal or non-functional harmony. Now we can return to our original thought experiment. How do we turn all these features into a single representative measurement of complexity? At first glance, it seems like we could just count the number of distinct features in each song's vocabulary. The more features, the more complex it is, right? That's broadly true, but not all of these features are created equally. For instance, borrowing a chord from an adjacent key is a relatively simple feature compared to, for example, modulating by 3 steps on the circle of fifths. To deal with this, I've come up with a point system that gives a different weight to each feature. In this system, the number of points earned by a borrowed chord depends on how far away it is on the circle of fifths. Adjacent keys get 1 point, keys that are 2 to 3 steps away get 2 points, and keys that are 4 or more steps away get 3 points. Diatonic chords with borrowed extensions are graded similarly, depending on the scale the extensions are borrowed from. Since modulations have a longer-lasting presence than borrowed chords, they have a greater impact on the song's complexity. Therefore, the point scaling for modulations is 1 greater than that of borrowed chords. An extra point is also given for modulations marked by a non-diatonic movement, as well as those which depart from or land on a borrowed chord. This can add up to quite a few points, as well it should for the strangest, most complex modulations. The rest of the point system is rather straightforward. Each instance of non-diatonic movement gets 1 point, as does each dominant chord subversion and each use of harmonic ostinato. Non-functional harmony gets 2 points. It's possible for a song to get 0 points overall, which indicates that it only has diatonic chords and no additional use of functional harmonic techniques. And remember, just like all earlier tabulations, points for a specific feature are only given once per song, no matter how frequently they are used. Once again, this is an analysis of vocabulary. Here is the outcome for this calculation for each album. The album with the greatest functional harmonic complexity is A Moon-Shaped Pool, followed by Hail to the Thief and OK Computer close together in second and third. In Rainbows is in fourth, followed by Amnesiac, The Bends, and Kid A, all jockeying for 5th through 7th place. The King of Limbs is far below in 8th, and of course Pablo Honey comes in last place. Most of these rankings matched my expectations, though I was a little surprised to see A Moon-Shaped Pool quite so high, and The King of Limbs quite so low. This isn't the whole story, though. We should also look at the spread of points within each album. I converted my usual mean absolute deviation into a measure of consistency, where an album with 100% consistency is one whose songs all have the exact same complexity. In contrast, an album with 0% consistency could be due to half the songs having 0 points and the other half having double the average. Here are the consistency values. To begin with, not only is A Moon-Shaped Pool the most complex, it is also the most consistent at 59%. The majority of songs on the album have at least moderate complexity, and not even one song has 0 points. In contrast, OK Computer and Hail to the Thief have only around 30% consistency, having some of the discography's most complex songs contrasted with at least a handful of very simple songs. In Rainbows, in fourth, is even less consistent at only 6%. In fact, half the songs on the album have 2 or fewer points, while among the remainder, Faust Arp and Body Snatchers are some of the discography's most complex songs. Consistency helps us distinguish between the similarly ranked Kid A with 28%, Amnesiac with 10%, and The Bends with 3%. The Bends is the least consistent album in the discography, with its average propped up by a handful of very complex songs like Just and Nice Dream, among a sea of very simple ones. Then finally, there is The King of Limbs at 14%, its low consistency due to the high complexity outlier Little by Little, and Pablo Honey at 32%, being somewhat consistent in its use of very simple functional harmony. Another way to visualize this spread is to see this chart broken down by song. Here we can easily visualize each album's consistency without having to necessarily resort to a number. At a glance, we can also see that 20% of the discography songs have 0 points, and finally, we can see which songs have the very highest complexity. Tied for first place are Just and Paranoid Android. I very much expected Paranoid Android to rank highly, being basically Radiohead's Bohemian Rhapsody with tons of modulations and borrowed chords, but Just was a bit of a surprise. Apparently, Tom and Johnny had challenged each other to use as many chords as possible for this song, which appears to have necessitated all kinds of unusual borrowings and chord movements. Third place goes to Faust Arp, which has a very tricky modulation and lots of unusual chromatic-sounding movements despite being a very short song. In fourth place is We Suck Young Blood, whose main riff is built on a very weird minor semitonal change that spirals into all kinds of unusual borrowed chords. Fifth place goes to Scatterbrain, a song I've already devoted an entire video to, whose chords sound deceptively simple despite there being a nuanced modulation and a bunch of borrowed chords. Then, sixth place goes to Dex Dark, seventh place to Little by Little, eighth place to Body Snatchers, and finally a two-way tie for ninth place between Nice Dream and 2 + 2 = 5. The album with the most songs in this top 10 is Hail to the Thief with 3. Conversely, Pablo Honey, Kid A, and Amnesiac don't have any songs in the top 10 at all. Also, interestingly, despite A Moon-Shaped Pool being the top-ranked album, it only has one song in the top 10. After all, the album's high consistency means having few outliers in either direction. It's nice enough to be able to see all these functional harmony trends, but there's another question that's been nagging at me. Since we know how Radiohead generally measures up on each metric, can we identify the Radiohead-est Radiohead Song? That is, the song that best captures the average functional harmony features of their discography. What would such a song look like? Let's re-examine some of these charts. In Radiohead's use of modes, the most common is the minor key. If we add up all the non-diatonic feature heat maps into one for the whole discography, we can see that for minor key songs, the most common modulation or borrowing is the Dorian mode, with the Phrygian being a close second place. But since less than a fifth of Radiohead songs have modulations at all, the Radiohead-est Song would probably only borrow from one or both of these modes. And then, looking at the trends in non-diatonic movements, the most common by far is the major-to-major chromatic mediant, occurring 78 times. In a distant second is the direct major-to-minor chord quality change at 21 times, and then at a very close third is the minor-to-minor chromatic mediant at 19 times. We could also stipulate that the Radiohead-est Song matches the average number of complexity points per song, close to 6, and the average number of non-diatonic chords in a song, close to 2. Using these criteria, I think a good match would be Reckoner, a minor key song from In Rainbows. It has 5 points and 2 non-diatonic chords, one of which is borrowed from the Dorian mode. It also contains both a major-to-major chromatic mediant and a minor-to-minor chromatic mediant. Overall, it's pretty similar to what you'd expect from the literal average Radiohead song. However, you could also make the argument that the Radiohead-est Song should be allowed to have more points and more non-diatonic chords than the average. After all, Radiohead's more complex songs are what make them unique. In contrast, there are a lot of very simple, forgettable songs, especially from their first 2 albums, that drag these averages down. So ignoring these parameters, what song would we get? Another good match for the Radiohead-est Song, and my personal pick for what song most feels like Radiohead's typical use of functional harmony, is Exit Music for a Film from OK Computer. This song is in a minor key and borrows from both the Dorian and Phrygian modes. It contains a very prominent major-to-major chromatic mediant, as well as 2 different direct major-to-minor chord quality changes. Of course, at 12 points, it has a few other functional harmony features that are somewhat less typical, but if anything, these help reflect the overall diversity of Radiohead's harmonic vocabulary. That about wraps up my analysis of Radiohead's use of functional harmony. There was an absolute ton of data involved, and hopefully I was able to boil it down into identifiable trends that enhance your appreciation of the complexity that Radiohead works into their music. I do have one last little thing to mention, though. After spending so much time analyzing and thinking about Radiohead's chord progressions, I began to notice a few places where they repeated harmonic techniques almost to the point of self-plagiarism. Of course, something like the reinterpretation of Morning Bell on Amnesiac is a facile example of this, but there are a few other places where you might not have noticed them recycling ideas. Probably the most distinct example is the resemblance between Like Spinning Plates and I Will. Both songs are in the key of C-sharp minor and have a main theme that uses C-sharp minor, A major, and G-sharp major. And then they vary this theme by adding E major and F-sharp major, this latter chord being borrowed from the C-sharp Dorian mode. At least from a functional harmony perspective, these 2 songs are nearly identical. Another strong similarity is between the verse of Optimistic and the verse of The Numbers. They are in different keys, but if you boil them down to chord functions, they have a very similar progression. The chord functions for Optimistic are 1 minor, flat 7 major, 2 minor, and 1 major. While The Numbers uses a 4 major instead of a 2 minor, which is a very common median substitution. There are also similarities between Pyramid Song and Everything in Its Right Place, both of whose main themes use the 1 major, flat 2 major, flat 3 major progression characteristic of the major Phrygian setting. And then finally, You and Blowout, both from Pablo Honey, incorporate a C-sharp minor to C major motif that quickly, in the case of You, or eventually, in the case of Blowout, leads back to the tonic E minor chord. Anyway, this video has gone on long enough, perhaps even too long. I'll leave you here with this visual summary of the main album-to-album trends and features. Feel free to pause and examine it at your leisure. And if you have any questions, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain.